There was a pattern in history that has destroyed every global empire that ever believed it was permanent. In 476 AD, Rome lost control of its currency, its borders, and its institutions, and within decades, the Western Empire vanished. In 1947, Britain ruled over 25% of the world's population, but after 2 wars and crushing debt, it surrendered its empire in less than 30 years. In December 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed in just 11 days, ending a superpower that once controlled half of Europe and 15 republics. Different centuries, different systems, same outcome. And right now, in 2025, the United States is moving through the exact same sequence, stage by stage, almost point for point. And here's what should terrify you. Every empire realizes what's happening only when it's too late to stop it. Before we go through this pattern and these examples, you need to understand what imperial collapse actually means. Not in textbooks, in practice. This isn't just about borders shrinking or flags coming down. It's about a system that once produced wealth, stability, and confidence reaching a point where it can no longer sustain itself. At first, nothing looks broken. Markets still function. Elections still happen. Armies still exist. But underneath, the mechanisms that made the empire powerful are quietly reversing. Debt replaces production. Influence replaces strength. Promises replace reality. And when that shift completes, collapse doesn't arrive slowly. It arrives suddenly. Here's what people don't understand. Empires don't fall because of one bad leader or one crisis. They fall because a long sequence of decisions creates pressures that can no longer be managed. By the time collapse becomes visible, the causes are decades old. It's not chaos, it's math. You cannot spend more than you produce forever. You cannot protect a global system without paying its real cost. You cannot delay consequences indefinitely. That's not theoretical. That's documented history. Rome didn't fall when the barbarians arrived. Britain didn't fall when it lost colonies. The Soviet Union didn't fall when the Berlin Wall came down. Those were symptoms. The collapse had already happened inside the system itself. And when that internal break reaches a certain point, events accelerate beyond anyone's control. Let me show you how this played out 3 times before, following the same stages, in different centuries, under different ideologies, and then I'll show you why it's happening again. Let's start with Rome. At its peak, around 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire controlled roughly 5 million square kilometers and governed between 60 and 70 million people, nearly 25% of the world's population at the time. It was the most powerful political and economic system on Earth. Roads stretched over 400,000 kilometers. Gold coins were trusted across 3 continents. Roman citizenship meant stability, order, and protection. But the pattern was already beginning. By the late 2nd century, around 180 AD, Rome entered the first stage without realizing it. Expansion had stopped. New conquests no longer paid for the system. Emperor Marcus Aurelius died in 180, and for the first time in generations, Rome faced a future without growth. The economy depended on constant inflows of wealth from conquered territories. When that stopped, the math changed. To maintain the army of roughly 300,000 soldiers and an expanding bureaucracy, Rome turned inward. Taxes increased, landowners were squeezed, small farmers disappeared. By 193 AD, Rome entered the second stage. Political instability exploded. In a single year, 5 emperors ruled. Armies no longer defended the state, they auctioned it. Emperor Septimius Severus openly told his sons to enrich the soldiers and ignore everyone else. Military spending surged. To pay for it, Rome began debasing its currency. The silver denarius, once over 90% silver under Augustus in 14 AD, fell below 50% by 200 AD. Inflation followed. Prices rose. Trust fell. But on the surface, Rome still looked strong. This is where it gets darker. By 235 AD, Rome entered the third stage, the crisis of the 3rd century. Over the next 50 years, there were more than 20 emperors, most ruling for less than 2 years. Borders were breached simultaneously by Goths, Persians, and Germanic tribes. Trade collapsed, cities shrank. The silver content of the denarius fell below 5% by 270 AD. That's not reform, that's monetary collapse. Emperor Aurelian tried to stabilize the system, but the damage was structural. Rome was no longer producing wealth, it was extracting it. By 284 AD, Emperor Diocletian attempted a reset. This marks the 4th stage, centralization and control. Diocletian doubled the size of the bureaucracy. He split the empire in 2. He fixed prices with the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, listing over 1,000 goods with state-mandated prices. The result was immediate: shortages, black markets, hoarding. Production collapsed further. Farmers were legally tied to their land. Sons were forced to inherit their fathers' professions. This wasn't strength, it was desperation. And here's the critical detail. By this point, Rome still had legions, it still had emperors, it still had ceremonies and titles, but it no longer had a functioning economic core. Taxes were increasingly collected in grain instead of money because the currency was worthless. Roads fell into disrepair. Local elites stopped investing in public life. Loyalty shifted from Rome to survival. By 330 AD, Constantine moved the capital to Constantinople, effectively abandoning the Western Empire. That decision alone tells you everything. The center of gravity had moved. The West was hollowed out. Over the next century, the fifth stage played out: fragmentation and collapse. In 410 AD, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric. In 455 AD, it was sacked again by the Vandals. And in 476 AD, the final Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer. No dramatic battle, no grand ending, just an administrative handover. From peak to collapse, the process took roughly 300 years. But the irreversible decline, from monetary breakdown to political collapse, took less than 100. What remained was not Rome as a superpower, but fragments, local rule, declining trade, a long economic dark age in Western Europe. That's what imperial collapse looks like in practice. Not sudden destruction, but a predictable sequence. Expansion stops. Debt and extraction replace growth. Currency breaks. Control tightens. The system fragments. Rome didn't fall because it was attacked. It fell because it could no longer sustain the system it built. Let's jump forward more than 300 years. The British Empire. In 1913, Britain controlled the largest empire in human history, governing roughly 412 million people, almost 23% of the world's population, across territories that covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. London was the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling backed global trade. British shipyards built over 50% of the world's merchant vessels. Just like Rome, it looked untouchable. The first stage began quietly. By 1870, Britain produced about 32% of global manufactured goods. By 1913, that number had fallen below 14%. The United States and Germany were outproducing Britain in steel, coal, and machinery. Expansion had peaked. The empire still generated prestige, but it no longer generated enough surplus to sustain itself. Just like Rome, Britain began living off past advantages rather than new growth. Then came the second stage, debt and financialization. World War I changed everything. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain spent roughly $9 billion on the war, an amount equal to more than 200% of its pre-war GDP. To pay for it, Britain borrowed heavily from the United States. By 1919, it had lost its status as the world's largest creditor and become the world's largest debtor. Sound familiar? The empire survived, but the economic core was damaged. Here's where the same mistake that destroyed Rome appears again. Britain tried to preserve the image of strength rather than accept reality. In 1925, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill, returned the pound to the gold standard at its pre-war value of 4.86. It was a catastrophic decision. British exports became uncompetitive overnight. Unemployment surged above 10%. Coal output collapsed. By 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard entirely. Currency credibility was gone. Just like Rome, the third stage arrived with political stress and social fracture. The Great Depression hit Britain hard. Industrial regions hollowed out. The 1936 Gero March wasn't symbolism, it was desperation. Meanwhile, the empire became more expensive to defend. Naval spending rose. Colonial unrest increased. Maintaining control required force, not consent. The same trap that caught Rome was closing. World War II accelerated everything. Between 1939 and 1945, Britain spent over $25 billion on the war, equivalent to more than 250% of GDP. By 1945, national debt exceeded 270% of GDP. Entire cities were destroyed. Industrial capacity was exhausted. Britain emerged on the winning side, but economically broken. This is where the fourth stage begins: centralization and managed decline. In 1944, the Bretton Woods system placed the US dollar, not the pound, at the center of global finance. Britain accepted a $3.75 billion loan from the United States in 1946, with conditions that forced the pound to become convertible. Within weeks, Britain lost over $1 billion in reserves. Rationing continued until 1954, nearly a decade after the war ended. An empire that once ruled global trade couldn't feed itself without controls. Just like Rome under Diocletian, Britain turned inward. Industries were nationalized, capital controls were imposed, taxes rose sharply. In 1948, the top marginal tax rate exceeded 90%. The welfare state expanded not from abundance, but from necessity. Meanwhile, the empire began to fracture. India gained independence in 1947. Palestine was abandoned in 1948. One by one, colonies became liabilities instead of assets. The fifth stage played out with remarkable speed. Between 1947 and 1965, Britain lost control of most of its empire. In 1956, the Suez Crisis exposed the reality. Britain and France attempted to seize the canal. The United States opposed them. The pound collapsed. Britain was forced to withdraw. In that moment, the illusion ended. The world saw what Britain already knew. The empire was over. Different century, different continent. Identical collapse. From peak power to imperial irrelevance in less than 50 years. Expansion stalled. Debt replaced production. Currency credibility failed. Control tightened. The system fragmented. The pattern played out again. Now, let's look at the most recent example, one you probably remember, the Soviet Union. In 1945, after World War II, the USSR emerged as one of two global superpowers. It controlled Eastern Europe, influenced governments across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and commanded the largest land empire in history, spanning 22.4 million square kilometers across 15 republics. By 1975, the Soviet military had over 5 million active and reserve personnel, more tanks than the rest of the world combined, and nuclear parity with the United States. On paper, it looked permanent. The first stage appeared in the 1960s, quietly. Growth stalled. Between 1950 and 1960, Soviet GDP grew at roughly 5.8% annually. By the late 1970s, growth had fallen below 2%. Productivity collapsed. Central planning rewarded quotas, not efficiency. Agriculture failed repeatedly. In 1972 alone, the USSR imported over 28 million tons of grain from the United States. An empire that claimed ideological superiority could not feed itself. Expansion had peaked. Then came the second stage, debt and artificial support. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union survived not through productivity, but through oil. After the 1973 oil shock, energy exports accounted for over 80% of Soviet hard currency earnings. This masked structural decay. Instead of reforming, the system doubled down. Military spending consumed between 15 and 17% of GDP by 1980. Civilian infrastructure decayed. Consumer goods vanished. The state maintained appearances by borrowing from the future. Here's where the acceleration begins. By 1979, the USSR entered the third stage with a single decision. Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion cost roughly 15,000 lives and an estimated 8 billion rubles annually. More importantly, it exposed the limits of power. Sanctions followed. Technology imports dried up. Just like Britain after World War I, the system could no longer compete economically with its rival. Just like Rome, borders became liabilities. Political legitimacy cracked. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union cycled through 3 leaders in 3 years. Brezhnev died in 1982, Andropov in 1984, Chernenko in 1985. An aging elite clung to control while the system decayed underneath. Black markets exploded. Corruption became systemic. The official economy stopped reflecting reality. The fourth stage arrived with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985. Centralization gave way to desperate reform. Perestroika, glasnost. Attempts to fix an unfixable system. Price controls were loosened without functioning markets to replace them. Output collapsed. Between 1989 and 1991, Soviet GDP fell by over 15%. Inflation surged. Republics stopped sending tax revenue to Moscow. Authority fragmented in real time. And then came the fifth stage, speed. In August 1991, a failed coup exposed how little control the central government actually had. Within 4 months, it was over. On December 8, 1991, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus dissolved the Soviet Union. On December 25th, Gorbachev resigned. On December 26th, the USSR formally ceased to exist. From superpower to collapse in 11 days of paperwork. Compare the timelines. Rome's final decline took nearly a century. Britain's imperial collapse unfolded over about 50 years. The Soviet Union disintegrated in less than 6. The pattern didn't just repeat, it accelerated. 3 times. 3 empires, 3 complete collapses. All following the exact same sequence.